Welcome to the sew-along of the Tiffany Thomas diaper set pattern. I hope you've gathered up your supplies and have been able to print your pattern out, and will be able to start with us as we begin making this cute outfit. I've my supplies here for sewing. I've got my Ginger scissors, I've got baby piping, the 60 weight Metler sewing thread, a fine point marker, a size 70 Microtex needle, my rotary cutter, and of course the rotary mat. And I do have my piping ruler. This particular brand ruler is no longer available, but an equally good one is by 10 Sisters. I'll provide links for all of these things below in case you need to pick up any of them. And then I've got my magnetic pin cushion and the glass head pins. And in addition to my regular sewing foot, I will be using, at various times, I'll be using the 1/4 inch foot, my zipper foot. That's what I prefer to use to make piping, although some people prefer to use a cording foot or a mini piping foot. An edge stitching or lace joining foot. This is the foot that has a blade in the middle of it. And then an open-toed foot. So I have, the pattern we'll be using is the Tiffany Thomas diaper set pattern that's available in my Etsy shop. I'll put a link to that below also. I have printed the pattern out, and I will be viewing the instructions on my iPad. I prefer to do that because when you get to any tricky places, or if you really want to get a better view of things, you can really zoom in if you're doing it on an iPad, whereas if you've printed it, it's just in print with whatever quality printer you have. But this, to me, is really helpful. So go ahead and gather your supplies, and we will begin sewing the outfit shortly. Of course, you can't sew without pressing, so I will also be using my Quilter's cut and press. This is a little bit larger than the one I use for on my lap for handwork, but it's great for pressing smaller items like this diaper shirt set when you're working on it. And I'll be using my Rowenta Perfect Steam Pro iron. I had to carry this up to my filming studio because all of this equipment for filming does not fit in my sewing studio. So it's really handy to have this iron because I can pick it up, carry it with me. It's heavy, but not so heavy that I can't carry it up and down a flight of stairs. And it puts out massive amounts of steam only when you want it to, because it only steams when you push this button here. So as long as I'm not holding that button, I can press and get the iron tip exactly where I need it to be, and then I can press the button and give it the heavy steam. So this has been a fabulous iron if you're in the market for a new iron. So let's get sewing. I like to do all my sewing in a particular sequence. So after I get a garment cut out, I tend to do transfer all the markings, and since I'm doing the top with the pleats on it, I've put little markings up at the top of the lower edge of the bodice where the pleats will go, and also the center front. So you want to do that. You also want to mark on your back yokes, whichever view you're using. You want to make sure that you get your center back and your fold line marked on both sides of the back piece. And with that, I also marked somewhere here Yeah, I also put my buttonhole marks in. It's easier to do that before you've started stitching them. So I get everything marked, and if you're using a fabric like me that is very difficult to tell the right from the wrong side, I put an R on each one of the right side pieces, unless I've interfaced it. So I have the sleeve cuff, it's got the interfacing on the back, so I don't need to mark the right side because that will be obvious. And then on the sleeve, the front and the back is indicated. There's no notch lines to really that you have to match up when you're sewing, so I just put one mark for the front, 2 marks for the back, and again I indicate my right and my side on both pieces so that I don't inadvertently sew it the wrong way. And then for the collar, on any of these views, if you're making a collar, and it does not matter if it's the 1-piece or the 2-piece collar, I find that you will get the prettiest collars with the most accurate stitching, and with both collars that look exactly the same. If you cut a rectangle of the fabric, and I need to mark this front, and align your grain lines and then trace around the pattern piece. Hopefully you can see that in this lighting, that I've traced around it. I've marked the shoulder and I've put an F for the front of each collar piece. If you do that and then apply your piping or whatever trim you might be using while it's in block form, you won't inadvertently stretch out the collar as you work on it. If you cut these pieces out and then start applying your piping or any other trim, you can see we've got quite a few curves that are on the bias. And the more you handle fabric on the bias, the more likely it is to stretch out of shape. And also, this is just more accurate. I'm sure you've seen other people who have posted pictures of their finished garments, and the front of one collar and the front of the other collar are not exactly the same shape. I find that doing it this way, that will never be a problem. So you want to cut one rectangle and interface that one, and then you need to cut another rectangle, which of course will go right sides together to sew it. Now the only time I do this tracing on the front, if you are doing say a girl's collar and you want to add entredeaux and lace to the collar, that's done after you sew this seam, the outside seam of the collar. So in that instance, you're going to want to trace the collar shape out on the back. When you are adding piping, you're going to stitch your piping to the collar piece, and then when you put your right sides together, you can sew from this side and your stitching line will be visible. If you're doing a lace application afterwards, you won't have a stitching line to follow, so you need to trace your collar out on the interfacing side. Hopefully that makes sense. And also, if you're doing that collar with lace, and I do show this in the instructions, but say you're using a 1/2 inch wide lace and the entredeaux, which is maybe 1/8 of an inch, you would want to trim away 5/8 of an inch from the front and the back of this collar, and that, just like it's shown here, you would round that off. And you can do that by hand, or you can use a small French curve if you have one to round that off. You don't necessarily need to trim away from the outside edge of the collar unless you want to keep it real narrow, but it's not a big collar to begin with, so I generally just trim it off the front and the back. So hopefully that makes sense and you have been able to get your pieces interfaced and get the pieces marked. After I have all that done, then I make my piping, if I'm planning to use piping anywhere on the garment. And there are tips on how to make the piping at the very end of the instructions. Can you find that? At the very end of all my patterns, I have a section called Tips and Techniques. And it covers things like how to make a French seam, how to make and join bias strips, how to make piping, understitching, whatever techniques are used in the pattern, there will be a section that discusses that techniques in the back at the end of the pattern. I don't like to include that in sequence in the instructions, because if you already know how to make piping, you don't want to have to go and read through all of that. So get your pattern pieces cut out, interfaced, trace the appropriate ones, and then we're going to come back and start making our piping and applying it to the garment. After getting all the interfacing on the various pieces and getting all the markings done on the pattern pieces, then I will make piping for all the pieces. And I prefer to cut piping in the length needed for each specific piece rather than joining long lengths together and then possibly having a join or a seam in the piping, you know, along the collar somewhere or on the sleeve cuff or whatever. Sometimes you need to have joins just because of the amount of fabric that you have available. But in this instance, I have plenty of fabric, so I cut individual pieces. And then to make the piping, several different feet can be used. Most of the time, I will choose my zipper foot. I like that one. I've used it for the last 35 years, so I'm very comfortable with that one. But it's also very easy to make piping using the 5 or 7 groove pin tuck foot, because the cording will ride right in that one of the grooves, and you can bump your needle over to the right or left, whichever direction, and get close to the piping or the cording. So those work well. Another one that a lot of people like to use is an applique foot. It's just a very short foot, so it does work for both making the piping as well as for going around curves because of the shortness of the foot. And you can see on the back side here, it's got a little indentation where the cording will rest as it goes through. And then some machines also have a mini piping foot. So I would recommend experimenting with the different feet and seeing which one you like to use, and then go ahead and make your piping. You can, when you're cutting your piping, you can cut it to the exact width that's needed for the piping. In this instance, because we're using 1/4 inch seams, you would only need a piping width of your 2 seam allowances plus 1/8 of an inch to go around the cording. Well, that would be a 5/8 inch wide piping bias strip. I don't like to work with such narrow widths, and I also don't like to have to be so exact in aligning the cut edges together. So I tend to cut my piping strips a little bit wider, anywhere from 1 inch to 1.5 inches, and then I will trim it so that the edges are exact afterwards, and I do that using my piping ruler. Let me get my foot on my machine here. And then I will start making my piping. Now, I also would like to mention that when you're making your piping, don't get as close as possible to the cording when you're making the piping, because you want to stitch closer each time that you know, if you stitch it, for instance, on the collar, we're going to stitch it to the collar. We're going to get one thread closer to the cording when we stitch the piping onto the collar. And then again, when we stitch the two collars, the top collar and the facing together, again, you're going to get one thread closer. So if you get too close when you're making your piping, you run into the risk of having that stitching line show, and you would not want that to happen. So go ahead and make all of your piping. Once all my piping is made, if you're like me and have cut it wider than it needs to be, then you're going to want to use your piping ruler and trim it to 1/4 of an inch. Now, the only exception to this would be if you are doing view D, which has the little smocked inset in it. If this is the view that you're doing, remember that your yoke and your lower skirt are going to have a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So that piping would need to be trimmed to a 1/2 inch. And again, that's another reason I tend to cut the piping wider than it needs to be. It covers more options. But you can see, although I'm fairly accurate with my stitching, there are little places where it's not exactly together. If you cut it wider and then trim afterwards, that's not a problem, because then you have a perfectly cut edge to work with. Whereas if you've got the narrow 5/8 inch and you're wrapping it around and trying to get it exact, you're probably going to be like me, and it's going to be close but not perfect. So once we get all our piping trimmed, then we're ready to start with our collar, and we will continue with the sew along in lesson 2 doing collars.